Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's special council meeting. As everyone knows, it's a strategic session focused on one main item, and then we'll go into in-camera on a couple items after that. So we will begin with the strategic session on tall buildings and the statement of expectations, and there's both a staff report as well as a number of attachments there. And I guess I'll turn it over to you, Alain, to start things off. No, hold on. I got to click you. Click yourself on again. There you go. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. In case we haven't had the pleasure to meet in the past, my name is Dana Edwards. I'm the planner of urban design. And I'm here with my colleague, Adam Clark, and we will be presenting to you our Tall Building Statement of Expectations document, which we've prepared over the past couple years. We have had the pleasure of meeting with a couple of you over the past couple of months to discuss this item. However, we're here today with a brief presentation, and then we'll get right into questions. So just to provide a little bit of background on the topic, in the fall of 2014, Council directed staff to prepare urban design guidelines for tall buildings. Through this process, we began to study design guidelines of other cities throughout the province, mostly larger than Kitchener, and we began to analyze some of these elements of tall building form, such as floor plate size, ratio, separation distance, and overlook. And what we determined through this process is that developing tall building guidelines is actually much more complex than we had thought, and we need to do more study and engagement to engage with stakeholders, but also the public. And through this, direction was given to us to prepare an interim statement of expectations. So we decided to move towards a three-stage approach. So the statement of expectations we'll work towards for approval in fall of 2016. We'll continue studying, doing more 3D modeling, more analysis of the topic, and over a year process, we'll work towards developing tall building urban design guidelines, which we hope to present by the end of 2017. So why are we studying tall buildings? The City of Kitchener, as you know, has seen the new development of tall buildings within but also outside the downtown over the past several years. And we do expect many more to come in the future. The ION, or the LRT, will be a catalyst for growth and development around these station areas. So we can expect the development of many more of these buildings in the future. The Statement of Expectations, as we have drafted, has a dual purpose. So it's designed to educate stakeholders about good tall building design, but it also outlines the City of Kitchener's expectations for how tall buildings should be designed. So it's a tool going forward in the future that we can use to work with stakeholders as they come in with development applications for tall buildings. So what have we defined a tall building as? We've used the definition of high-rise in the new OP, the city's new official plan, as a benchmark. So we've defined it as a building that's 9 stories or greater. As you may know, tall buildings do have a significant impact on surroundings where they're located. So we have, at this time, applied the tall building of statement expectations citywide. So it's the current geography that we're looking at is the entire city.
Thank you, Dana. So I'm just going to go over some of the content of the Tall Building Statement of Expectations very briefly. What we developed through the process of preparing this document were a series of key considerations for tall building design. And those are meant to be educative statements about what those elements are and how they relate to tall building design without being prescriptive to a very specific number or design practice at this stage. So we have scale and compatibility, first of all, and that deals with things like fit into the neighborhood, important things like setbacks, step backs, transition down to lower rise residential neighborhoods or other neighborhoods, and overall just being compatible with the surroundings of a new tall building, and that's very important. The second item is safe and vibrant streets. So that's talking about the kind of active uses that we desire for the ground floor of a tall building design, particularly one in the downtown, in which we anticipate retail uses or other active uses that keep the ground plane active throughout the day and night, with pedestrian traffic, with retail customers, with other uses, inhabitants to keep the streets safe, active, and used at all times. Third, we have public and private open spaces, and this is a hierarchy of spaces that can be created within a tall building site. Tall buildings have the luxury of being able to create a lot of interesting spaces as they relate to the tower design, the top design, the podium design, and the interfaces with the streetscape. So these are dealing with things like the streetscape, rooftop patios, private balconies, but also public open spaces are also very important to tall building design. The fourth item is microclimate and four-season design. This deals with the impacts of a tall building, particularly those from an environmental standpoint, wind impacts, solar impacts, shading, snow accumulation and shedding, those kinds of slightly more technical aspects of tall building design, and trying to minimize any negative impacts, especially at the public street level, so that we don't impede pedestrian traffic or make it less comfortable for them to be there. So continuing on, the next item is view, sunlight, and sky view. This deals with the importance of preserving views to important landmarks in the city, not blocking them with a large tower. Also views from the tower and optimizing those for inhabitants and residents. It looks at sky view, which is if you sort of just look up and are surrounded by tall buildings, how much of the sky is available or visible to you as a pedestrian or as a person in the public realm or in a nearby park or open space. It's important to preserve that so that we have access to the sun for our open spaces. And also just to sort of keep sunlight on the public realm and the surrounding areas and to keep the streets pleasant for occupants. The next item is sustainability, and these are how tall buildings impact their environment. There are a number of sustainable measures that a tall building can implement. The technologies that are available are numerous and can have an incredible impact on a building's impact for carbon impacts through energy usage, through passive solar heating and daylight, things like that. And so then we also have materials and massing in architecture, and these are more sort of design-related things about the importance of materials, the importance of designing a building so that the materials read as distinct and unique, but also fit within the context of the neighborhood in which they exist. Making sure that our tall buildings are interesting, that they're attractive, that they make their surrounding areas a fun and exciting experience for people who live and work in those buildings, but also to the public at large. And so continuing on that...
Sorry, just before you continue, there's a few of you that have clicked in. I'm going to hold all the questions until the end unless everyone's okay with that? Okay, go ahead.
We're very close to the end.
Yeah,
anyway.
no worries.
So an important thing about the statement of expectations and about tall building design is that the elements of tall building design, which we discussed toward the end of the document, they're relative to one another. They work in tandem with one another, and that no single guideline delivers an effective solution to tall building design. These are things that impact one another on a relative basis and need to be understood and fully explained and described so that we get tall buildings that are well designed and don't just conform to a certain number that we've decided is appropriate. So the way that relationship works is we see that we have these built form considerations that we've put into the document, and those are tower separation distance, overlook, tower orientation, tower floor plate, ground level and podium design, and tower and top design. And the graphic at the bottom of this slide is just meant to represent that there are many different fits for these elements to work together in harmony to create a good tall building. They can all be sort of equal, as shown on the left, or if one of those items needs to be different, larger, smaller, we can adjust everything else in a relative way to make that kind of fit. So it's not about just finding the one fit for our tall buildings. It's about having a flexible set of guidelines in the statement that helps to work with the many complex features of tall building design to create the best buildings that we can in the city.
So just to highlight some of our next steps, where we're hoping to go. The Tall Building Statement of Expectations has been developed in conjunction with the community as well as with stakeholders, and it will be tested over the coming years as we continue to study tall buildings in Kitchener. So as Appendix B is our feedback report, which outlines all of the feedback we've received through our multiple engagement channels. Over the coming years, staff will continue our 3D modeling, we'll continue the analysis of the local context, and we'll continue to do more stakeholder engagement and more public engagement as well. Through continued work over the years, staff are confident that a complete set of tall building design guidelines will be able to be presented to Council this time next year prior to the end of 2017. So thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you for the presentation. Got several sets of questions for you. First is Councillor Yanetsky.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, and it was a pleasure, using that word, to review your document here, and lovely pictures, designs, and analysis, and I thought it was well done. It provides that information. Before I end, I have a few questions I want to ask you, but I also just want to mention to the Mayor that I'll be happy to move the motion at the appropriate time. 9 stories. Why that number? Why wasn't it 12? Why wasn't it 6? How do you come up with that figure?
So through the through the chair, through our official plan review, we looked at the definition of high-rise as what it was outlined in the official plan, and 9 stories was the definition of a high-rise building. Now, we understand that depending on the context and depending on the width of the right-of-way, that tall buildings that are taller and on smaller streets can appear larger, and where the right-of-way is larger, maybe a building can appear smaller. So 9 stories is what we would like to test through the Statement of Expectations, and we'll be looking at that number a lot more carefully as we move forward to creating the tall building guidelines over the next year. But at this time, it was thought that the City of Kitchener official plan outlines a high-rise as 9 stories, so we will go with that number to be consistent with our official plan. Okay.
With the criteria that you have here to look at buildings that are 9, 10 stories and higher, if you get an application for development for a building that's maybe 5, 6, 8 stories, would this same criteria be applied, or are you just not going to ignore it? How are you going to handle that? Are you going to use the urban design features to sort of address it at the same time?
Yeah, one of the great things about this document is the Statement of Expectations, as it outlines really good design principles and design practices. And while the Tall Building Statement of Expectations applies to tall buildings which are 9 stories and higher, some of the principles and guidelines for the podium level or the middle level applies really well to mid-rise buildings. It's generally the same. So you can apply some of those principles as you're looking at mid-rise or low-rise buildings. It won't apply directly as part of the urban design manual at this stage, but as good practice, you can employ some of those principles towards mid-rise development as well.
Now, in Kitchener, we have basically several buildings that are greater than 9 stories, up to about 20 stories, roughly. And I guess depending on the municipality's thoughts as to what you want to look like in the future, is that sort of an area we're going to stop at the 20-story? Are we going to try to go higher? I mean, you look at Toronto, of course, it's a much bigger city. They're up in the 50s, 60s. In fact, in a couple of days, last week in the paper, they're talking about 80, 90, 100-story condo buildings, etc. Are we going to put a cap on height here at all through maybe not urban design, but maybe with zoning, or is it going to work together, or is the urban design going to work somehow to address that? Help me out.
So this is, as you know, there are design guidelines, and the zoning and the official plan policies will dictate more towards height. However, through the development of these guidelines, we're hoping that as the zoning is created over the next couple of years for the downtown and through some of the station areas, that these guidelines can influence that zoning, and that we can work together to create really good zoning. In terms of the height and density, that will be established through other planning documents.
And I appreciate that. And one of the slides that you had about the building form, etc., that criteria could fall into the site plan analysis when you do that. but also from an architectural perspective, an architect can design the building, like looking at our own city hall. It's got great design features. Would those be incorporated already in here as asking the architect to come up with something spectacular looking?
Yeah, so in our materials and architectural design section, we look at what some of those elements are that create excellent tall building design from an architectural perspective. One of the things that we're careful not to do is to try to prescribe too much about how to design a building for an architect, because we want to encourage, lively, interesting, attractive, innovative buildings.
Exactly.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, and that is an issue. So when I look, we do have some interesting buildings already, like, of course, the City Hall. The Canada Trust building is a couple of blocks away with the domes. They're very different, but they're very unique in their own way because they're set back. And more buildings like that would be a welcome to the area, as opposed to just a straight 12-story box-type scenario that does its function in terms of providing accommodation, but doesn't look anything spectacular. So my time is up, too. Thank you.
Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you for meeting with me before this. I think I found it quite detailed the first time around. It's a little bit less detailed and a little bit clearer when I'm looking at it now. And I don't know that I read this in the document yet. So I'm asking, have you thought about a sort of a stepped approach towards the tall building? So because I think I would hate to see upon entering Kitchener, and I know we have a few near the Rockway Senior Centre, we have a couple of taller buildings there, but if the skyline is just going to be, as you're coming into Kitchener, it's going to be just 9 plus 12, 15, 16 stories, I'm afraid you're going to change the skyline and not make it quite as welcoming. Is that something you're looking at? And conversely, through coming from Waterloo towards the hospital, the same kind of concept. Have you thought about how you'll include that in the guidelines?
Three, Mr. Chair. So we certainly look at transitions as being a very important part of this guideline, and so that hopefully gets incorporated into the way that we transition down to our stable neighborhoods. When we come into the city, we gradually work up our way to a skyline or to the downtown, in which we have a point in which we have our tallest buildings, and then we taper off from there. And that we do that sort of in any case where we have a lot of tall buildings, whether that's downtown or there are some suburban areas where there are many tall apartment blocks. So by having transitional policies in place, we can sort of guide that, and we can look at what the surrounding context is. We can look at the scale and compatibility of a new tall building development and say, well, this isn't appropriate because it goes from 16 stories and it wants to shoot up to 35 stories, and then we're back down to 7 stories. So those are the kinds of things that we definitely look at through this document, and we'll have a clear picture of in the tall building guidelines to come. Okay.
So you mentioned the concern you have of having, a bunch of tall buildings clustered together, and I think I know which area you're referring to. My big concern always around that is the shadowing and the tunneling, the wind tunneling effect that you see around that. So that, I think, is, I know you said you are taking that into consideration. I think that's really critical. I mean, even in Toronto, if you go on a particular day, you can literally get blown down the road. I think that doesn't make it very positive, I guess, for interaction between people and shops and things like that, if you're feeling like you're buffeted all the way along. So I think that's really important. Green space, as we grow higher up, we will take less footprint, but also the vistas of the green space. Is that something you're looking at too? So if you've got, building A, building B, if they're looking at towards the where the center and the square is, there's a lot of green space. It looks very pretty. Or if you're looking towards the Victoria Park, it's lovely to look at. Is that something you're going to be taking into consideration as well? So how it's oriented?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. So the importance of views, it's one of the items in our key considerations is views in sunlight, and that includes preservation of views to important landmarks and to important green spaces in the city. So I think our best example of that is looking down Gaukel Street to the clock tower presently, and those are the kinds of things that are important to us to preserve. And we're going to look at what those elements are in the city through our further investigation of this topic to determine what those key view corridors are.
Okay. One of the presentations that one of our youth made to us, I think it was in the spring, you're talking about green roofs. One of the things that they talked about was white roofs and how it reflects the heat. Is that something that you can build into the urban design? I mean, they were talking about that it's as easy as just going in and encouraging building owners to paint the top of their roofs. Is that something that you might look into as well?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the strengths of the statement of expectations is it provides that education. So I think that's something that we will look at through this and through the project as we move forward in the next year, because that is really important. We have a sustainability section, and we offer advice as to how the developer can incorporate elements of sustainability into their development. So that is one of the things we will be looking at going forward.
Okay. I'd love to be able to tell those students that, you know, we might be incorporating some of that idea into our urban design. Great, thank you.
Councillor Singh?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Not too much. I realize that this is our first real look at this, and this is an extensive body of work that still needs to be completed on this. But of course, it's probably one of the most important works that's underway because it will define how our city will look in the next 100 years. And the right type of controls are absolutely necessary to make sure that that look and feel is right. But at the same time, we have to be cautious that we don't make it so prohibitive that we lose the development that we hope to attract as well. So going forward, how much consultation in equal form has taken place with the general public as well as the development community? And before we get to the final product, what further engagement will take place as well?
Through the chair, to date we have had our open house and workshop on June 8th. We've also had the topic up on Engage Kitchener. What we've done with some of the feedback we received was use that to create the principles of this document and to create this as a guiding document moving forward for urban design and the design of tall buildings. As we move forward towards the next year and towards the creation of guidelines, we'll do more separate engagement. So we'll do public engagement separate, and we'll be engaging with different stakeholder groups at that time. As it stands, we feel that many of the stakeholders will have more of an interest in the development of the actual guidelines. So we'll be more engaged with them as towards the creation of those design guidelines.
So as the intensification and the increased density starts to take form in our city, we obviously have started having key players in the development community that are active in acquisition as well as starting to propose development as well. It'd be great to have many, many more, but again, there are a few, and that's great. Are we looking to have one-on-one interviews with them as well? So it's a more comprehensive conversation as opposed to just a public forum.
Go ahead.
Yes, through...
Oh, hang on, you didn't click in there. Hang on. Oh, too many are in. Just hang on. One sec. And now you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, we will. And what I can say is that at this point, we had integrated consultation where we're hearing from both the community at large and the development industry. Moving forward towards the urban design guidelines, we'll actually be consulting with the development industry independently so that we can hear their perspective, in addition to talking to the community members as well.
It's great. I see architecture as being a component of this, and I'm really glad to see this. I think we need to put a higher expectation on our developers. And in the end, I think it only increases their bottom line when the product that's developed is attractive and more marketable. Stuff that has developed in recent years, as an example, I won't name the developer, but off of Fallow Field, the cinder blocks. Will that type of development continue to take place once we have a policy such as this established, or is it easy to say that stuff like that will not be allowed?
Through the chair, like some of the developers that we currently have in the downtown that are doing our more better work have fewer challenges with the statement of expectations and the design guidelines to come. It will be more challenging for some of the other developers that aren't doing the high quality work within the city to maybe meet some of these guidelines and standards. So for them, I think this gives them a little bit of time to consider some of the things that are outlined in the statement of expectations and as we move forward towards guidelines, but to use this as a document that will help them understand why some of these practices exist and to know that these are some of the expectations for the City of Kitchener in terms of tall building design.
Now, our staff starting to consider, and I think this work needs to be in tandem in our one-on-one meetings. I think I mentioned this as we review some other planning documents as well as to density and bonusing. So that I think it was said through you guys that we want narrower but taller is better than large footprints. Is that something that would maybe consider that if it's something is more architecturally unique, but allow bonusing elsewhere to make it more, I guess, as a better business case for the developer to do?
Maybe I'll weigh in on this one, and through you again, Mr. Mayor. So the one illustration that Adam spoke to where it's not a one-size-fits-all, and sometimes where you're dealing with the relationship between the components. So sometimes you need to make certain components bigger because of uniqueness of site, or sometimes for even economics, can be compensated for by adjusting other components of the tall building. So that is the principle and the philosophy that we're using moving forward at this time, because the conversation has just started. We don't have the actual numerics, but what we are finding is that the hard and fast numbers that other communities are working probably would not translate well for Kitchener because they have different economics, but also because the urban context is very different. So we do intend to have something that allows the interplay of the different components of tall buildings in order to make different sites work.
Glad to hear that. Thank you for all your efforts.
Councillor Etherington.
Through you, Mr. Chair, a couple of quick questions. Paralleling what Councillor Singh just said, can you tell me how you will be meeting with the equally important neighbourhood groups that will be looking at these tall buildings?
Through the chair, we did engage with the neighborhood associations through our open house and workshop that we had in June. We did engage through Engage Kitchener, which we had about 30 responses from around the city in terms of the document. And as we move forward, we will continue to engage with the public and the neighborhood groups over the coming year as we work towards the development of guidelines. So they will be invited back. They will be continually engaging with us. We have a lot of engaged citizens from many of the neighborhoods across the city, so we expect them to be continually involved in this process as we move forward.
That's great to hear, and I did see some of them at the meetings you referred to. My other question relates to the regional buildings on top of the hub. What controls, will you have this in place in time to deal with those buildings, which I think could go up to 25 stories or higher? Will you be able to influence how those buildings look and the impact it has on surrounding neighborhoods?
Through the chair, yeah, when any new development application comes in, including the ones for the hub, this will be a tool that staff will use to work with the developer to provide design feedback for those buildings, but also will assist staff when they're doing the review of tall building applications, that they understand which principles are important and some of the things to look for. So it will be used to influence that design and to improve any design of tall building applications that come in.
Thank you. I have a couple of comments, Mr. Chair. I'll wait for comments.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. A couple questions. Just First of all, I love the work that you've done. I think it's terrific. I think it's comprehensive, and I think it's going to go a long way towards making it clear what our expectations are. So that's congratulations on that hard work. I want to understand a bit better, how will the statement of expectations change the staff's interactions with proponents of proposed developments? In other words, if an application comes in that does fit in with the expectations, will that application be treated in a more in a quicker way? Will it be? Will we attempt to decrease the red tape or streamline the processes to make that development smoother, or are there any ways that you can encourage the applications to fit with the statement of expectation?
So having the statement of expectations available and readily available through the Urban Design Manual, this will be something that we can use through pre-submission. And we're hoping that having this available and outlining our expectations and making them clear will help developers come in with something that meets what staff is looking for, without having to have many conversations and going back and forth. This provides a clear guidance for what we'd like to see through development applications, sets out the principles that we'd be looking at, and provides staff with that tool so that when they're reviewing the applications, they can look at this document as well. So
yeah, that's fine. But as you mentioned earlier, there will be some developers who already are in line with these expectations and others that will have challenges meeting these. So how will staff respond to those different types of applications? Even though we have these expectations and it's clear, some won't follow them. So can we use other ways to incentivize good development?
Yeah. So through you, Mr. Mayor, we do have some other tools. We have some policies, we have some zoning tools, and a lot of them do work hand in hand with guidelines. These are pre-guidelines. What we do expect is that this is what we ask for when people come in the door. A lot of times when they come in the door, it's actually maybe a year or even later before they actually file an application. What we're hoping to do is actually get people familiar with what we're asking for and understand the language that surrounds tall buildings, and we want to develop a culture of understanding what constitutes a good tall building. Depending on the type of approval that's being sought, some of them do come before council. Council does have the ability to refuse those applications. If it's one that we think is not going to have a positive contribution to the city, staff will not be recommending approval of those. If it's something that we've been delegated approval authority for, such as site plan approval, there may be a small gray area somewhere near the middle, but if it's something that we think competes with this very strongly, we do not have to issue that site plan approval. Of course, we could end up getting appealed, but that is something that we will deal with on a case-by-case basis. Our feeling is that the people who have done good things and have built buildings that most of us talk about quite with pride, they will not be challenged to meet these urban design guidelines. Some buildings that have maybe prompted us to develop a framework around regulation around tall buildings, they will be more challenged. We think that it's important for not only staff, because we've been saying these things in pre-submission consultation for some time now. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes the outcome isn't quite as close to what we're seeing here today. But the fact that if council approves this, it's not only staff that's asking for this, it's our council, which is the voice of the community.
Great. So just what I'd like to encourage over the next year as the guidelines are being developed further is to find ways to concretely sell the idea to developers to show how they will benefit. You know, in some cases, they will benefit financially from being more sustainable, for example. But also, if there are ways that our planning department can incentivize good development by fast-tracking, ones that check all the boxes, that would be, time equals money, right? And when you're trying to develop a huge building. And so that would be another way for us. I would just encourage you to consider that, so that we don't just hope in good faith that all the good developers will come to Kitchener, but that and stay in Kitchener, because there are already some. But that also that we find ways to put these actions more concretely, in the view. Tell it from the viewpoint of the developer. That's all I'm saying.
Just one quick note of information on that, if I can, Mr. Mayor, and that is, members of council will recall that we tabled new zoning for the downtown. Mm-hmm. And we are taking an incentive-based approach, mm-hmm. and where the base level for height, it's really density, but it translates into height most times, is actually quite low, and in order to get higher, you have to do good things. Some of those good things are things that actually translate into these guidelines as well. So they do work hand in hand. That complementary tool is really where the incentives do kick in, and where we actually have strong control on the size parts of it. Mm-hmm. And this is the balance, the making it work so that it fits in well from all other aesthetics.
Wonderful.
And impacts.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor Verbanovic. And I just want to thank staff for meeting with me as well and going over this document. I know it's a lot of work, and I think there's a lot of good work in here. And I don't have a question on whether or not we need a policy. We need a policy. I just have a few concerns. One of the concerns is you mentioned the protection of views, and when you start saying protection of views, how are you going to do that? Because a lot of those corridors that you're looking at protecting, they're all zoned to be high rise and everything else. So isn't it kind of counterproductive? Or do you have an idea how you're going to implement that?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, it does get very specific on which view you are preserving. In some cases, it's a view corridor down a street, in which case we look at setting buildings, podiums back, for example, so that those views are preserved. Where there's a case where there's clearly an important development parcel between something and something else, if development's going to happen there, that might not be what we're trying to preserve as a view. We'll be considering the impacts of development when choosing what those views are. There are some that are more key than others, but there are also different ways to preserve different types of view corridors, and that's mostly through the public realm that we're concerned with that. So it does sort of, maybe you peel back a corner feature a bit so that you can see through to something that's important. But it would be very rare that a tower on a developable parcel, particularly in the downtown or an intensification area, would impact a view corridor to an important landmark just by virtue of the way that the street grid is divided up, things like that, open spaces, et cetera.
Okay. That's just a concern of mine, because I know the corporation owns properties that eventually will one day be up for sale, and I'm just concerned that we may be cutting some of our profits out of selling those properties. The other thing that I'm looking at is, are we looking at outside factors with regards to this? And what I mean by that is, the region's looking at putting in additional development charges. Are we factoring any outside conditions when we're looking at this?
Through the chair, this is just a design exercise at this time. We're thinking that as we move forward, we will take a look at some of the economics and the impact that some of these design guidelines may have over the study through the coming year. as that has been highlighted as a concern. But at this time, this statement of expectations just outlines principles of good design.
Okay, I can appreciate that, and I just would like for us to look at this holistically, because I have really great concerns with the future development of this community and with the amount of prohibition that we're implementing. And as we saw in the newspaper, we're not getting the assessment growth like everyone said. So I think we need to slow down a little bit before so we can get this right. Okay, and my final question is regards with the timeline. Do you feel the 1-year timeline isn't it not aggressive? Because to me it seems kind of aggressive, and I'm not seeing a lot of applications coming into the city right now for high-rise development as it is. So is there a way to maybe phase in this a little better?
Through the chair, we've chosen the 1-year time frame as it recently became apparent to us that we have the resources going ahead to be able to complete it within that time. From our perspective, we do have quite a few pre-submissions and applications in line that we think could benefit from this. We'd like to try to pilot those over the coming year and work towards the development of guidelines. We do have a draft as we were originally moving forward towards the creation of the guidelines when the stage approach became a little more appropriate, and that was recommended to us by our peer reviewers, and we decided to go with that. So we do have a draft that we'll be working from, and we're hoping that with the engagement, depending on how that goes, that we would be able to deliver a product by the end of 2017.
Okay. Again, thanks for the body of work you guys done, and I look forward to seeing the process through. That's all, Mr. Mayor.
Can you turn? There we go. Councillor Singh, do you have questions or your comments? Okay, Councillor Fernandez was first, and then yourself.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, because I looked through again quickly to see any reference to about heritage buildings, and there's always a possibility that a demolition of some buildings may put a site available for a very tall building beside something that has some heritage features. Maybe it's not designated, but it has a unique architecture to it. How are we going to be working that into this guideline?
Through the chair, great question. That was something that we had thought about a lot through this process. We had considered heritage in terms of scale and compatibility when we looked at the scale and compatibility section to make sure the design of the new building is compatible with the heritage area or heritage features without mimicking that design in its entirety. So we have heritage impact assessments that are in place that are designed to make sure there's no negative impact of a new tall building. So we have a little bit of language in there that talks about looking at established neighborhoods and the heritage and making sure those are protected and reflected in the context. But we leave it to the heritage impact assessment to ensure there's no negative impacts.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just in addition to that, the scale and compatibility section may not mention heritage specifically, but that's because in our statement of expectations, we expect that all tall building development will be respective of its surrounding context in all cases.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's really important because if you look at our any of our heritage buildings, certainly they might reach 4 stories at the most, and anything that shadow, rain, wind, all of that will have a dramatic effect on some of those buildings because they're older, and so I'm glad to see that there is some talk about and thought around that. Okay.
Councillor Singh.
Yeah, thank you. I think Councillor Ioannidis raised a good point about the timing and how rapidly we're rushing to implement this. As development is taking place in our outlying communities, neighboring communities, obviously we're in competition to attract sometimes. And so simply we can't afford to get this wrong. So because there is a consideration to look at it in a context of a trial project as well, is it better to not implement or adopt the bylaw and rather go through a slower phase in working with the developers and through incentives, obviously, to get exactly what we want out of this and seeing how that works out, and then slow and over time implementing a full comprehensive document, because we've tried it, we've tested it, and it works.
Through the chair, I think that has been our major goal throughout this process, is to make sure that we deliver something that works within the City of Kitchener's context and that is actually defensible and appropriate to the community. So as we move forward, the year is our target. We will be doing more studies, more engagement. If we do find that we are not ready, we will not be bringing anything forward. The 1 year will give us a chance to pilot some of these new developments we see in the queue. But what we want to offer too is a holistic approach that looks at many elements of tall building design and not just one aspect, such as tower separation. And that at this time we're working towards guidelines, so nothing will be brought forward in terms of a bylaw that is set in stone. We will be working through some of these developments, seeing what works, what doesn't work, and working towards guidelines that are flexible, that are also defensible. So.
I have 400% confidence in our staff that the desire is to get it right. Mm-hmm. But I also realize what is theoretical doesn't always translate the same way when it becomes practical. And that's why I'm encouraged to hear that there is a trial aspect, but a year still seems not long enough, because we're talking about big projects here. Mm-hmm. And these sometimes don't come in in multiple forms in that short period of time. So rather than giving a trying to at least give my comments, leave staff to carry on their work. But if you're approaching seeing we should perhaps, allow for a longer period of time to have more development proposals come forward, so we have more trial and tested, I would encourage that. But I'll leave it in staff's hand.
Just to follow up on that quickly, it can be very challenging to strike that balance between, ideally we want as much at the same time we have to be conscientious of not ending up with several very bad buildings because we don't have anything in place.
And I think that's an important point on the timeline piece. And obviously, I think as staff have pointed out, if they need additional time, and we're hearing from the industry we need additional time, then I think we can weigh that. But I'd rather see us, because of the number of things that I think we are that are either in the pre-submission stage or still at the meeting with staff or myself and others stage. From an idea point of view, I think we want to have this sooner rather than later, so that we can make sure that we have good policies in place as soon as possible. I think that's it for questions. So, Councillor Netsky, if you'd like to bring the motion in, and then we have several comments.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to bring the motion forward as recommended by staff in their staff report. It's straightforward. I want to commend staff on a very forward-moving process from a planning perspective for our community. I love the title, Tall Buildings Statement of Expectations. That captures it all perfectly in terms of where we need to go with the tall buildings, and an expectation from the stakeholders, the architects, the public, anybody who will be involved directly or indirectly. And that sort of tells them what we want and what we want the city to look like. And by having this sort of laid out in terms of what our expectations are, and they can read that, then we can have something of a vibrant, exciting city for the next 21st century. Having my previous year's work in planning, we really didn't have anything of that nature during the 70s, 80s, 90s. We had zoning bylaws, we had criteria that we worked with, but you followed the rules and you did that. And what the building looked like and how it all fitted in, it just was sort of, you hoped for the best was sort of the approach. but sometimes you need foresight to move forward several steps, and this is one way of doing it. So I think this is a very exciting way of going forward for the 21st century for our city, and I look forward to beautiful buildings and beautiful layouts for our community.
Thank you, Councillor Yanetsky. Councillor Ioannidis.
Thanks, Mayor Urbanek. Again, I just want to comment. I think we do need some guidelines, and I do appreciate that we're looking at urban design and having great design, and through other tools. And I think that, again, that to me is the most important, because when you have good buildings, most people won't see a negative to it when you have a great building. And it's just like when you go to any city and you drive into the city and you see, wow, you look at all the good designs. It shows that we take care of our community in the sense that we want our community to grow and look good. So again, I think I'm glad we're looking at those tools, and again, I look forward to seeing the rest of this when it comes up.
Councillor Etherington.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would just ask planners not to slow your process. Don't drag your planning heels. Get it done as soon as possible so that we're not caught short with the kind of ugly, poor constructed high-rises that we've already got our share of those around the city. Cookie-cutter buildings. I find it comforting to see this happening. I think it's overdue, and this emphasis on high-quality design for tall buildings, if for nothing else, in order to avoid the disaster we see in the neighboring city up at Columbia and King. It's a disaster. I would urge planners to focus on, as they look at tall buildings, focus on the impact they have on neighboring structures, and most importantly to me, on the impact they have on adjacent communities. And that, by the way, has been mentioned, take great care when these are happening close to the few remaining heritage buildings we still have. Thanks.
Councillor Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Obviously, I'm biased with this opinion, but I think we absolutely live in a phenomenal community that's becoming more and more apparent to others in nearby cities, and it's becoming a more attractive place to come and live and work and play. And because of that, I think we're poised for rapid development. I appreciate the answer and comments that you made, Mr. Mayor, that we need to ensure that we do get this in time to ensure that the building proposals that are in line right now are done the right way, are the right look and feel for our community. But at the same time, we have to ensure that it's a balanced approach. We can't be rushing so fast because we're concerned about 3 to 5 buildings, but we compromise hundreds of buildings that are yet to come. And that's why I was placing my comment of caution. As I said, it does need to be balanced, and I think we need to work through this in a format of incentivizing and cooperatively working with our development community. And I appreciate the reference that Councillor Etherington made to our general residents of this community, who need to have the right say to see that the development that takes place, the high density, is not infringing on their lives and their residences and their neighborhoods as well. And that's why I think that needs to be equally, if not as important of a voice than anything else. But we have to try our best to ensure that it is as balanced as possible with the development community, so that we can be encouraging and reap the rewards in getting the right type of development in our community that will complement and as well as enrich of what we have already. And I'll quickly put in a plug. I think that's why it's so important to look at all avenues of public engagement, as well as the currently in process of review by staff of a advisory committee that would consist of residents and development community that could give that balanced voice and view. But I'm glad the work that staff are undertaking, and very encouraged and pleased, and I look forward to see what the final product will look.
Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Mayor.
Whoops. Okay,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
Thank you so much, Mayor Bravanovic. I want to thank staff for an excellent report and, again, the opportunity to meet before this meeting to get an opportunity to ask a lot of questions and to dig deeper into this. It was really helpful. The engagement that you did and the feedback report, it's in the expectations, and that's great. I like this approach. It does show balance. It doesn't handcuff our developers. I think it actually helps inspire some greatness from them. And this is, as Councillor Yanetsky said, well-titled Statement of Expectations. So thank you for all the engagement you did and the hard work on this, and I look forward to seeing some greatness, some great expectations. Thank you.
Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you. As I listen to my colleagues around the Horseshoe, I think there's a distinct difference in how we want to see staff approach this. So I want to make it clear that I believe that our tall buildings expectations are important because we're going to be affecting our infrastructure as well. Anything that gets built is going to impact the street level, where the people walk and where people will be driving, and how the wind and the snow are addressed and how our transit is addressed. So we need to be proactive, because I'm a little bit concerned that once the development industry thinks that there's a little bit of wiggle room here, they're going to be coming in with gangbusters with a bunch of applications, and then we're going to be looking at no guidelines in place soon enough to make sure that we have the right design and the right fit for different parts of our city. I've already mentioned heritage. I've already mentioned environment. I think those are two critical components, as well as how our city looks as we enter into the city, how our skyline looks when we're in a sort of a more traditional neighborhood. Do we want to look like Toronto, where everything is popping up here, there, and everywhere? Probably not. I think we want to make sure that people feel very comfortable being in our downtown core, and as they transition into the neighborhoods, that transition feels very good, and it still has that really strong community feeling. I think if you walk, say, for example, from the library and the regional offices down through the corridor into City Hall, that feels really comfortable, feels very open and pleasant, and notwithstanding some outside influences from residents living in those areas, but the buildings, the amount of light, and the green spaces that are interjected, those are so vital for people who live in tall buildings. They have to have the ability to walk within 5 minutes to a green space. So I think I see that in this document. I hope that the future conversations you have with the development industry, that you'll be able to maintain and hold on to the integrity of what you've already done. Thanks.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you. Like Councillor Schneider, I didn't ask any questions. I had most of my questions answered when I met with Ms. Edwards and Mr. Clark. I just wanted to comment and wanted to acknowledge the work there, and I also wanted to comment on the timely nature of this coming forward. I recall, I don't recall the exact figure, but before the city center condos were built next door to this building, it had been some 10, 12 number of years before there was a tall building built in the downtown. Now we have City Center, and we have 1 Victoria and 100 Victoria. That's 4 buildings on the docket right now. So with the DC's exemption expiring in 2019, I really think that we're catching this in time. I think that in terms of the tall buildings, we've seen a lot of stuff happening in Waterloo, but I think the snowball is starting to roll down the hill on the other side here in Kitchener, so we need to make sure that we get it right. So again, I think this is good work. I think we're going in the right direction. I look forward to seeing what we come back with.
Looks like those are all the comments. I'll just make my own. I too want to thank staff for a really thorough job that's been done on this body of work to get it to this preliminary point. I think it is a very key piece of work, because it is going to speak to our cityscape and our skyline that is in all likelihood going to be in existence for the next 100 years plus. And so, looking at this carefully, thoughtfully, and making good recommendations with input from all parties concerned is going to be important. I do think moving forward from a timing perspective is key. I'm always the first one to say if we need to take a little bit of extra time to get it right, that's fine. But I also applaud staff for recognizing that this is an important issue that potentially has some real sensitivities associated with it in the near to medium future, and not taking too much, making it a priority rather, without compromising on the quality, I think is going to be key. When we talk about height, it does play a big factor, not only in how the city looks, but in people's perceptions of comfort, safety, and so on. And what is a comfortable height on a 2-lane roadway is very different than what's a comfortable height on a 4-lane roadway. And I think any of members of council that have ever participated in the parade, either the Santa Claus or the Oktoberfest parade, that's probably your best indication of what it feels like as you're either walking or riding on a float, and you're on a 2-lane roadway with buildings beside you versus a 4-lane, and how those heights relate to you really hit home at that period of time. Maybe even something that some of our planners, I know Santa Claus parade's coming up later this in November. It may be something some of our planners may want to do, at least for the Kitchener portion, as they look at this. And I think some good points have been made in terms of some of our heritage buildings and how some of these new buildings are going to relate to them. And yet there's some very creative examples, and I think in particular in BCE Place in Toronto, where you've got the old historical Canadian Chamber of Commerce building. I think it's owned by used by BMO now. In BCE Place, but the way they've taken a historical building and which is now enveloped with by this high rise is a really cool example of the kinds of things you can do. I think of a high rise in a shopping mall attached to a church in downtown Montreal as another example. So there's some really great examples of how these buildings can be integrated with each other. So with that, the motion has been made, and all those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Thank you very much. So the only other item we have on this special council agenda is to go into caucus for the 2 items indicated. Moved by Councillor Fernandez, seconded by Councillor Ioannidis. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Sorry. Oh, you're in there. Okay, go ahead, Councillor Gazzola.
I don't know if I have a conflict. Apparently you're talking about something you talked about a few weeks ago, which I had an apparent conflict, so I must still have a conflict.
Mr. Wilmer, can you help here?
Yes, given the nature of the topic this evening, in my estimation, there's no risk of a conflict here for Councillor Gazzola.
I would tend to agree with that, but if you want to talk to us ahead of time, Councillor Gazzola, we'll let you. You can make your determination, and you can declare it if you still feel you need to in caucus and then in public next time. Okay. So all those in favor of going to camera? Opposed? That's carried. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Marsh, Councillor Davey. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And we'll start in 5 minutes. Thank you.